Californy Gold, 18.3. Tobacco-chewing President Taylor, with his stumpy legs, rough features, heavy jaw, black hair, ruddy complexion, and squinty gray eyes, was a military square peg and political round hole. He would have been spared much turmoil if he could have continued to sit on the slavery lid. But the discovery of gold on the American River near Sutter's Mill, California, early in 1848, blew the cover off. A horde of adventurers poured into the valleys of California, singing "Oh, Susanna" and shouting, "Gold, gold, gold." They began tearing frantically at the yellow, graveled streams and hills. A fortunate view of the beard and mines struck it rich at the diggings, but the luckless many, who netted blisters instead of nuggets, probably would have been money well ahead if they had stayed home unaffected by gold fever, which was often followed by more deadly fevers. The most reliable profits were made by those who mined the miners, notably by charging outrageous rates for laundry and other personal services. Some soiled clothing was even sent as far as the Hawaiian Islands for washing. Many of the 49ers who flopped in California kept chasing the dream of gold in even more distant places, notably Australia in 1851. So what these two paragraphs state is, with so many people moving west, President Taylor, when they say that he cannot avoid the slavery lid, where he cannot no longer sit on a slavery lid, what this means is that with so many people moving westward, that for the gold rush, of course, that they would need to go ahead and add more states to the Union, thus bringing up the issue of slavery. What we understand here is, while a lot of people were they were very much looking forward to finding gold in the California region, uh, many of them did not. In fact, a lot of them lost money. The ones that made money were specifically those that were charging people for services that were gold miners, right? For example, doing their laundries. The California gold rush attracted tens of thousands of people to the future Golden State almost overnight, completely overwhelming the one-horse territorial government, A distressingly high proportion of newcomers were lawless men, accompanied or followed by virtuous women. A contemporary song ran, "Oh, what was your name in the States? Was it Thompson or Johnson or Bates? Did you murder your wife and fly for your life? Say what was your name in the States?" So what this is basically saying is that the people that were moving westward were women with a lack of religious virtue, and also men. An outburst of crime inevitably resulted in the presence of so many miscreants and outcasts. Robbery, claim jumping, and murder was commonplace, and such violence was only partly discouraged by rough vigilante violence. In San Francisco from 1848 to 1846, there were scores of lawless killings, but only 3 semi-legal hangings. So all in all, a lot of crime was going on in the Golden State. A majority of Californians, as a decent law-abiding citizens needing protection, grappled earnestly with the problem of erecting an adequate state government. Privately, encouraged by President Taylor, they drafted a constitution in 1849 that excluded slavery and then boldly applied to Congress for admission. California, thus, bypassed the usual territorial stage, thwarting Southern congressmen seeking to block free soil. Southern politicians, alarmed by the Californians' impertinent stroke for freedom, arose in violent opposition. Would California prove to be the golden straw that broke the back of the Union? President Taylor, he recommended that the people of California come up with a constitution. However, one of the things that they did was they excluded slavery. As a result of this, Congress was very unhappy. So what the author of the book is saying is, could California be the one that starts a civil war? Because the issue of sectionalism and slavery is very much present. So looking at that, a couple things that we should have, we kind of answered. We answered number 4, as well as we're getting into number 5. And then also you can say we answered 6A. Sectional balance in the Underground Railroad. The South of 1850 was relatively well off. It then enjoyed, as it had from the beginning, more than its share of nation's leadership. Its seat in the White House, the war hero Zachary Taylor, a Virginia-born, slave-owning planter from Louisiana. It boosted a majority in the cabinet on the Supreme Court. It outnumbered in the House. The South had equality in the Senate, where it could at least neutralize northern maneuvers. Its cotton fields were expanding, and cotton prices were profitably high. Few sane people, North or South, believed that slavery was seriously threatened, where it already existed below the Mason-Dixon line. The 15 slave states could easily veto any proposed constitutional amendment. So what this is saying here is the South had most of the power, more specifically, political power. Yet the South was deeply worried. Excuse me. Yet the South was deeply worried, as it had been for several decades, by the ever-tipping political balance. There were 15 states that were slave and 15 free states. The admission of California would destroy the delicate equilibrium in the Senate, perhaps forever. Potential slave territory under an American flag was running short. It had not, in fact, disappeared. Agitation already developed in the territories in New Mexico and Utah for admission as non-slave states. The fate of California might well establish a precedent for the rest of Mexican cession territory, an area purchased largely with Southern blood. So what we end up getting here is the South still feels very much worried, more specifically because New Mexico and Utah, they want to be admitted as non-slave states, and so does California. Texas nursed an additional grievance of its own. It claimed a huge area east of the Rio Grande and north to the 42nd parallel, embracing, in part, about half the territory of present-day New Mexico. The federal government was proposing to detach this prize, while hot-blooded Texans were threatening to descend upon Santa Fe and seize what they regarded as rightfully theirs. The explosive quarrel foreshadowed shooting. That paragraph is important. It kind of relates to this question right here. So, although Texas has been admitted to the Union, there's a lot of discrepancy over where its borders are, right? So Texas is actually arguing that its borders are further westward than it really is. Many Southerners were also angered by the nagging agitation in the North for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. They looked with alarm on the prospect of a 10-mile square oasis of free soil, thrust between slaveholding Maryland and slaveholding Virginia. So another point of discrepancy would be the District of Columbia. Northerners are arguing that it should be a free territory, although it falls in between Maryland and Virginia, which is a slave territory. Even more disagreeable to the South was the loss of runaway slaves, many of whom were assisted north by the Underground Railroad. This virtual freedom train consisted of an informal chain of stations, anti-slavery homes, through which scores of passengers were spirited by conductors, usually white and black abolitionists, from the slave states, the Free Soil Sanctuary of Canada. The most amazing of these conductors was an illiterate runaway slave from Maryland, fearless Harriet Tubman. During 19 forays in the South, she rescued more than 300 slaves, including her aged parents, and deservedly earned the title Moses. Lively imaginations later exaggerated the reach of the Underground Railroad and its station masters, but its importance was undisputed. By 1850, Southerners were demanding a new and more stringent fugitive slave law. The old one passed by Congress in 1793 had proved inadequate to cope with runaways, especially since unfriendly state authorities failed to provide needed cooperation. Unlike cattle thieves, the abolitionists who ran the Underground Railroad did not gain personally from their lawlessness. But to slave owners, the loss was infuriating, whatever the motives. The moral judgments of the abolitionists seemed, in some ways, more galling than outright theft. They reflected not only a holier-than-thou attitude, but a refusal to obey the laws solemnly passed by Congress. Estimates indicate that the South in 1850 was losing perhaps 1,000 runaways a year out of its total of some 4 million slaves. In fact, more blacks probably gained their freedom by self-purchase or voluntary emancipation than ever escaped. But the principle weighed heavily with the slave masters. They rested their argument in the Constitution, which they claimed, not entirely implausibly, protected slavery, and on the laws of Congress, which explicitly provided for slave catching. Although a loss of property is felt, said a Southern Southerner, the loss of honor is felt still more. So another issue that we have is the Underground Railroads, led by Harriet Tubman. These two paragraphs kind of discuss that although the amount of slaves that were actually freed are kind of exaggerated throughout time, the Underground Railroad is important to understand, specifically because Southerners were very much upset about the amount of slaves that were moving north, more for the principle than they are for the amount of slaves that actually were transported and freed. Uh, so when they're saying there's a loss of principle that exists, that means that they were unhappy that Northerners were not abiding by the fugitive slave law. And so we went ahead and we answered these sections right here, right? 18.5, Twilight of the Senatorial Giants. Southern fears were such that Congress was confronted with a catastrophe in 1850. Free Soil California was banging on the door for admission. Fire eaters in the South were voicing ominous threats of secession. In October 1849, Southerners had announced their intention to convene the following year in Nashville, Tennessee, to consider withdrawing from the Union. Failure of the Congress to act could easily mean the failure of the United States as a country. The crisis brought in to the Congressional Forum, that most distinguished assemblage of statesmen since the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The old guard with a dying generation, the young gladiators of the new. That immoral trio, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, appeared together for a last time on the public stage. Henry Clay, now 73 years old, Henry Clay, now 73 years of age, played a crucial role. The great compromiser had come to the Senate from Kentucky to reprise a role he had played twice before in Missouri in the nullification crisis. The once glamorous statesman, though disillusioned, enfeebled, and racked by a cruel cough, was still eloquent, conciliatory, and captivating. He proposed and skillfully defended a series of compromises. He was ably defended by 37-year-old Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the little giant, 5'4", whose role was less spectacular but even more important. Clay urged with all his persuasiveness that North and South both make concessions, and the North partially yield by enacting a more feasible fugitive slave law. Senator John C. Calhoun, the great nullifier, then 68, and dying of tuberculosis, championed the South in his last formal speech. Too weak to deliver himself, he sat, bundled up in the Senate chamber, his eyes glowing with a stern face, while a younger colleague read his fateful words. I have, senators, believed from the first time that the agitation on the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion. Although approving the purpose of Clay's proposed concessions, Calhoun rejected them as not providing adequate safeguards for Southern rights. His impassioned plea was to leave slavery alone, return runaway slaves, give the South its rights as a minority, and restore political balance. He had in view, and was later revealed, an utterly unworkable scheme of electing two presidents, one from the North and one from the South, each wielding a veto. So these three paragraphs are very important because it brings up, this paragraph here, that when they say that immoral trio, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, appear together for the last time on a public stage. So you're getting very experienced politicians that go back to even chapters 12 and 13, discussing this issue of slavery and what should be done. Henry Clay, who was labeled, remember, the great compromiser, one of the things that he proposes is that both North and South should make secessions, and the North partially yield by enacting a more feasible fugitive slave law. So what he's discussing is that they should both kind of come to an agreement, but the North should make sure that they're returning fugitive slaves back to the South. Senator Calhoun, completely the opposite. Although he agrees with some parts of Clay, one of the things that he is arguing is that the North should just leave slavery alone, right? Return slaves and give the South its rights as a minority and restore political balance, right? Although he seems very much that he's negotiating here, he's very much favoring the South, and in some ways, some people are looking at it as looking at secession, as he is looking at a North and the South to have their own president. Calhoun died in 1850, before the debate was over, murmuring the sad words, "The South, the South, the South. God knows what will become of her." Appreciative fellow citizens in Charleston erected to his memory on an imposing monument, which bore the inscription, "Truth, Justice, and the Constitution." Calhoun had labored to preserve the Union and had taken a stand on the Constitution, but his proposals in their behalf almost undid both. Daniel Webster, next to the Senate spotlight to uphold Clay's compromise, measures in his last great speech, a 3-hour effort, now 68 years old, and suffering from a liver complaint aggravated by high living. He had lost some of his fire and his magnificent voice. Speaking deliberately and before overflowing galleries, he urged all reasonable concessions to the South, including a new fugitive slave law with teeth. As for slavery in the territories, asked Webster, why legislate on the subject? To do so was an act of sacrilege, for Almighty God had already passed a woman proviso. The good Lord had declared, through climate, topography, and geography, that a plantation economy, and hence a slave economy, could not profitably exist in Mexican secession territory. Webster sanely concluded that a compromise, concession, and sweet reasonableness would provide the only solutions. Let us not be pygmies, he pleaded, in case that calls for men. If measured by his media effects, Webster famed 7th of March speech of 1850 was its finest. It held in the tide, the North towards compromise. The clamor for printed copies became so great that Webster mailed out more than 100,000, remarking that 200,000 would not satisfy the demand. His tremendous effort visibly strengthened Union sentiment. It was especially pleasing to the banking and commercial centers of the North, which stood to lose millions of dollars by secession. One prominent banker canceled 2 notes of Webster's, totaling 5,000, sent a personal check for 1,000, a message of congratulations. But the Free Soilers and abolitionists, who had assumed Webster was one of them, upbraided him as a traitor, worthy of bracketing with Benedict Arnold. The poet, John Green Whittier, lamented, "So fallen, so lost, the light withdrawn, which once he wore, the glory from his gray hairs gone, forevermore." These approaches were most unfair. Webster had long regarded slavery as evil, but this union is worse. Okay, so we went ahead. We have answered questions 7, 8, 9, and 10. How did the South hold an advantageous position in national government as of 1850? Well, remember, they had the majority in the House. Most of the Supreme Court was supportive of the South, and as well as the executive branch was in the South, but they still feared the abolition of slavery or the end of slavery. What complaints did the South have with the national government? One of them was that the North was not following the fugitive slave law, that it was not strict enough. What was the Underground Railroad? And who were the Old Guard? These were both answers. Of course, with the Old Guard, those names that you want to make sure that you understand were, of course, though I just read, Webster, Calhoun, and Henry Clay. What was the purpose of Daniel Webster's 7th of March speech? Basically, to conserve the Union. Those were some of the things that he was very concerned about. Was to Yeah, I mean, so Southerners criticized him specifically because they felt as if he was not following the Constitution and threatening slavery. However, Northerners felt as if that he was not being aggressive enough. So let's go back. Deadlock and danger on Capitol Hill. The stormy congressional debate of 1850 was not finished, for the young guard from the North were yet to have their say. This was a group of newer leaders who, unlike the aging old guard, had not grown up with the Union. They are more interested in purging and purifying than in patching and preserving it. William H. Seward, the weary and husky-throated freshman senator from New York, was the able spokesman for many of the younger Northern radicals. As a strong anti-slavery, he came out of unequivocally against concession. He seemed not to realize that compromise had brought the Union together. That when sections could no longer compromise, they would have to part company. Seward argued earnestly that Christian legislators must obey God's moral law as well as man's mundane law. He therefore appealed with reference to excluding slavery in the territories to an even higher law than the Constitution. This alarming phrase, wrested from its context, may have cost him the presidential nomination in 1860. So you have William H. Seward from New York. He's arguing that slavery should be abolished, more specifically because it's God's moral law. As a great debate in Congress ran its heated course, deadlock seemed certain. Blunt old President Taylor, who had allegedly fallen under the influence of men like higher law Seward, seemed bent on vetoing any compromise passed by Congress. His military ire was aroused by threats of Texas to seize Santa Fe. He appeared to be doggedly determined to Jacksonize the dissenters if need be by leading an army against the Texans in a person and hanging all damn traitors. If troops had begun to march, the South probably would have rallied to the defense of Texas, and the Civil War might have erupted in 1850. So, looking at this paragraph, what you're getting at President Taylor, he feels very much threatened by Texas, threats of Texas to seize Santa Fe, right? Um, so what he's concerned about is when he says he dodged, and let me kind of step back. I mean, of course, remember Texas, there's a dispute on whether or not that Santa Fe territory belongs to them, right? Um, there's threats that they're going to militarily go ahead and try to take that territory, which would have belonged to New Mexico. Uh, and remember, Texas is a state that they are very much pro-slavery. Um, what we end up getting here is that uh, President Taylor is saying that when he's going to Jacksonize these dissenters, he's arguing that he is going to use his military to stop any violence that exists. Our author says that this might have led to the Civil War because other southern states would have may have come and defended Texas. Breaking the Congressional Logjam. At the height of controversy in 1850, President Taylor unknowingly helped the cause of concession by dying suddenly, probably of an acute intestinal disorder. Portly, round-faced President Millard Fillmore, a colorless and conciliatory New York lawyer politician, took over the reins. As presiding officer of the Senate, he had been impressed with the arguments for conciliation, and he gladly signed a series of compromise measures that passed Congress after 7 long months of stormy debate. The balancing interest in the 1850 compromise was delicate and extreme. See Table 18.1. Concessions to the north. California would be admitted as a free state. The remainder of the Mexican cession area to be formed into the territories of New Mexico and Utah without restriction on slavery, hence open to popular sovereignty. So what this is saying here is California would be admitted as a free state, and then we're looking at these other territories of New Mexico, Utah, without restriction on slavery, hence open to popular sovereignty. Well, this means that the people would have the right to decide if they would want this to be a slave or a free state. The struggle to get these measures accepted by the country was hardly less heated than in Congress. In the Northern states, Union savers like Senators Clay, Webster, and Douglas ordered on behalf of the compromise. The ailing Clay himself delivered more than 70 speeches as a powerful sentiment for acceptance, gradually criticized in the North. It was threatened by a growing spirit of goodwill, which sprang partly from feeling of relief and partly from the upsurge of prosperity enriched by California gold. But the fire eaters of the South were still violently opposed to concessions. One extreme South Carolina newspaper vowed that it loathed the Union, hated the North as much as it did hell itself. A movement in the South to boycott Northern goods gained some headway. But in the end, the Southern Unionists, assisted by the warm glow of prosperity, prevailed. In June 1850, the assemblage of Southern extremists met in Nashville, ironically near the burial place of Andrew Jackson. The delegates not only took a strong position in favor of slavery, but condemned the compromise measures then being hammered on Congress. Meeting again in November, after the bills had passed, the convention proved to be a dud. By that time, Southern opinion had reluctantly accepted the verdict of Congress. Like the calm after the storm, a second era of good feelings dawned. Disquieting talk of secession subsided. Peace-loving people, both North and South, were determined that the compromise should be finality, and explosive issue of slavery should be buried. But this placid period overall, too brief. So we want to understand here is that Clay, Webster, and Calhoun They were advocates for the Compromise of 1850. They were giving speeches that supported the compromise. That's why they're very important. You could even tie this back to the previous section where Clay, Webster, and Calhoun, they kind of discuss the importance of why they're so important. Explain the conflict between the Union savers and the fire eaters. The fire eaters of the South were those that were completely against the Compromise of 1850, right? While the Union savers, although they were in the South, they supported. Sorry, actually, let me take that back. I mean, when you're just getting Union savers, they supported uh, the Compromise of 1850, right? So although they might have not agreed with every part of it, they felt it was more important to save the Union. And they kind of say here with the fire eaters, they were opposed to concessions, right? And a lot of them from the South, they hated the North and actually started to boycott Northern goods, right? How did the death of President Taylor help get the Compromise of 1850? Uh, kind of says so here in that very first paragraph, um, right here, round faced President Millard Fillmore, right? He was officer of Senate, had been impressed with the arguments of conciliation, and he gladly signed the series of compromises that passed Congress after 7 long months of stormy debate. So, what you're getting with him is he is the one that's actually going to sign this into power, right? And using that table in 18.1, you will find your response in that section.